All right, listening in on that is Dr. Ebrahim Harvey. Doc, thank you very much for your time this morning. Perhaps just an overall thought in terms of the tone of events as we saw them yesterday, before we get into the manifesto and details contained therein.
Hi, good morning, thanks. The manifesto, firstly, I don't want to go into great length, but a manifesto should never be as long. I mean, 260, 70 pages, frankly, and I think it's got to do partly with the lack of skills to write and formulate. I mean, I could take that manifesto and bring it down to 100 pages and retain the substantial, points of that manifesto. But nevertheless, it's largely a redistributionist manifesto. It's correctly that, because we're in the midst of the biggest socio-economic crisis in post-apartheid South Africa. So the issues that they raise are critically important, but I think we'll need to dissect. We'll see what questions you put to me, but we need to dissect aspects of the manifesto that I think are in order and others highly problematic.
Okay, let's start with state capacity. I think for the point of this conversation, we'll take a look at state capacity as well as the fiscal and monetary framework that the EFF is proposing. So on page 213, where it speaks of state capacity, it reads, and I quote, "The EFF government will retain ownership of all state-owned companies and entities under the control of the state and ensure that they are all efficiently run and managed. The EFF government will renationalize Sasol and ArcelorMittal and maximally expand the capacity of the African Exploration, Mining and Finance Corporation as a state-owned mining company." What is your recollection of how Sasol, ArcelorMittal, etc. got to be privatized from being national assets, and what is the reality of them being renationalized, do you perceive?
Well, there are two twin, inseparable problems with that. The first one is that it's true. I mean, something has to be done. The state-owned enterprises has basically fallen apart. They've collapsed under the weight of the corruption that began when former President Zuma was in office. So our state-owned enterprises are in a mess completely. Some serious fundamental revision and reworking of state enterprises is required. But the underlying serious problem that Malema and the EFF is going to face, and I don't think they realize how serious it is. We are sitting with the worst fiscal crisis in post-apartheid South Africa. Public investment and expenses has drastically been cut back, over the past few years. So they're calling for a redistributionist manifesto, largely, which I completely agree with. Remember, we're in the midst of the worst load shedding, cost of living crisis, socio-economic crisis ever imposed. So it's right, but I think they are being highly naive, to be very frank with you, about where the state is going to get the resources, when in fact we've been having, the opposite taking place in the past few years, serious cutbacks in budget and so on. So how Malema and the EFF is going to fund this proposed manifesto and the changes that it envisages is the very, very big question. But I can tell you there's another problem, which the EFF seems to be very naive about. The ANC, because of what it has done to state-owned enterprises, has given a very negative public connotation to anything owned and run by the state. It's rampant with corruption, you've seen. And in fact, maybe an unwitting intention, but I'll tell you something. What the ANC has done to the state-owned enterprises has left a very sad legacy and has actually besmirched the whole nobility of public enterprises and bringing things under public ownership, state ownership, because indeed, I think there's an argument to be made that there are many examples around the world where public services have worked very well, and that introducing the private sector is not necessarily the best thing unless you're able to configure a private situation in which there are no distinct disadvantages, which often result in these things for the poor people who can't afford the increase in the price of services which follows privatization. But I think Malema and the EFF underestimate the serious damage that the ANC has done to the whole notion of nationalization of public services. of public services, yes. And he needs to go and study what has happened in this country over the past 10 years in particular. And I don't think he takes that into account. It's very negative environment about nationalizing anything, including the formation of a state bank that he repeatedly talks about. I don't think he looks at the serious consequences of what the ANC has done to this whole notion of nationalization.
What about abolishing tenders, right? So under state capacity or creating state capacity, there's 46 points there. Point 9, there's sub-points, and they range from A to Z. And so it reads the EFF government will immediately abolish tenders for A, cleaning services, security guard services, gardening, construction and maintenance services, consultants, and it goes all the way until Z. And so what are the chances of immediately abolishing tenders? What would need to be unlocked in terms of the law for this to be a reality?
Oh, you'd have to revamp and, it's a massive job. You know, institutionally, tenders and contracts are part of every level of the state. How do you just simply get rid of it? And what you replace it with? You know what I think should rather happen? The EFF should focus on cleansing. The tender, it has been rampant with corruption. It needs to be cleansed. It needs to be reviewed, and the loopholes need to be eliminated and dealt with. But to remove tenders and to abolish tenders completely, you're talking about a massive long-term project. And I don't think we at that stage at the moment where we can simply do away with tenders as much as it has been rampantly a source of corruption at every level of the state. So I agree with Malema and the EFF that tenders needs to be revisited, but to abolish them, I think it's naive, it's unrealistic, it's not going to happen, certainly not in the short to medium term.
Point 16, Dr. Harvey reads, the EFF government will disallow the use of bottled water in all government facilities, including state-owned entities. If it is impractical to use tap water, bottled water will be purchased from black-owned companies and women and youth-owned companies will be prioritized. Would that not require a tender?
Well,
or am I being naive?
It probably would, but also there's a serious problem. You know, let me tell you something. There's no time to go in. The EFF is very weak on basic municipal services. You must go and look at their manifesto. They don't even talk about prepaid water, electricity meters. It has wreaked havoc in townships. I studied that. My doctoral dissertation is based. They talk nothing about prepaid and electricity water meters. I mean, when you talk of electricity, they talk about 200 kilowatts hour free. First they say for all poor households. In the same sentence they say universal provision for all households. So what are you saying? Poor households or universal? It's a very different thing. And I think the Municipal Systems Act and Structures Act of 2000 and the EFF and the ANC needs to go and study. Because in fact that is where the problem began. That's why you've got an avalanche of township protests. Those things, they commercialize, corporatize, and commodified basic services. That's why you've got Pikita. That's why you've got Johannesburg Water. That's why you've got City Power. They shut down all the municipal departments under NP rule. They work very well, let me tell you. The only problem was that they were provided to the whites and not black people. But they were amongst the best infrastructural services, let me tell you, that we had. The ANC shut it down upon the advice of the World Bank and so on, and formed these corporatized utilities which have themselves become the source of lots of corruption, and you just need to go and do research, which is why when Mashaba took over in 2016, let me tell you what he wanted to do. He wanted to shut down every corporatized utility, Joburg Water, and take them back into the municipality because of what had happened. So I think these nuances and differences and issues, Malema and the EF really, they know very little. In fact, they hardly get involved in. If you look at the one area that's sorely neglected, they talk about the black working class youth, is the townships. Where do you find the EFF involved in organizing township residents against this terrible service delivery crisis that we're sitting with at the moment? You hardly see them there.
Dr. Harvey will expand on that in a few moments. Let's take maybe a look, because as you mentioned, this is a 260-page document at fiscal and the monetary framework of the EFF. It says, and I read point 27 of this particular theme, the EFF government will combine all municipalities' pension funds into one municipal employees' pension fund with an investment mandate that focuses on municipal infrastructure development. 28, the EFF government will reduce the cabinet to half of its size currently and eradicate the positions of deputy ministers. The EFF government will reduce VAT to 14%. The government of the EFF will highlight employment targeting as the primary measure of the fiscal policy. It will establish a state-controlled credit rating agency to provide independent assessments of the national economy and counteract bias from international rating agencies. What have you made of the fiscal monetary policy of the EFF, or the proposed fiscal monetary policy? Is it realistic?
No, it's not. It's totally to the contrary. This is the startling thing about this redistribution. As I agree, that definitely we're caught up in the midst of this crisis. You need that. You need to look at the land question, the jobs, especially because the black youth in particular suffers most from structural unemployment and so on. But I'll tell you something. I think the EFF needs to have a serious review about the fiscal framework within which you'll be able to accommodate the changes and some very fundamental changes. Already you can see what's been happening to public expenditure. I mean, over the past few years, it's been cut back severely. So at this moment, when public expenditure is at its lowest in post-apartheid South Africa, where is the EFF going to get the funds to implement what I think is otherwise commendable? Much of it is there, many things that one could take issue with. But I think the more positive things that they seek to change through this manifesto is going to require massive resources. We're sitting with the biggest economic and socio-economic crisis ever in post-apartheid right now. So, while in word it appears very attractive and plausible, the fiscal framework is running in an opposite direction. And I don't think they've given serious, because they don't even talk about those very severe neoliberal fiscal constraints that have been there actually from 1996 when GAIR was adopted. It's a very conservative macroeconomic framework which cuts back. That's why you can see what's been happening, and the unions have been, crying foul over the past few years with the budgetary cutbacks. So I don't know where the EFF is going to get the funds, or the state will get those funds to implement what I think is otherwise, commendable aspects of that election manifesto of the EFF.
Dr. Harvey, you need not dig far to find a poll in terms of 2024, more so with the election year and how parties are allegedly faring when the polls speak to South Africans. For the purpose of this discussion, perhaps, when you look at the polls, maybe the Ipsos polls that indicates that many South Africans are confused to say, well, which party represents my views? Maybe let's look at the example of the city of Johannesburg and the coalition government there. You speak of the needs of the people in township areas, right? And so what is it that you have seen and the contribution of this particular party that has launched its manifesto in getting the city of Johannesburg right? A lot is being said about coalitions, more so at a national level. At a municipal level, where services are supposed to be distributed, how would you rate that?
No, I mean, you know what? You must remember, when you pose that question to me, the most important, the most powerful and richest municipality in the entire continent of Africa is in Johannesburg, where you today, for the past 2-3 years, have the biggest political crisis that has torn apart local government, and the biggest losers whenever you have this crisis in coalition government are the ordinary people in the townships that is already sitting with a massive backlog of infrastructural services that have not been provided through a combination of corruption and incompetence. Johannesburg is the most unfortunate, let me tell you, manifestation of the mess of a coalition government. But don't think that you're necessarily going to have the same thing happening. It's a very different level and set of dynamics. If, for example, the ANC loses the 2024 and we end up with a nationally constituted coalition government, it's going to be very different. to what's happening in the townships and in the Joburg and the metros. It's very important to recognize, because a lot of people think that it will just repeat itself. A national coalition government will be set with the same failures and fragmentation as you've seen at local level. It need not be that way. But let me tell you, that is the biggest problem, and in fact, it's the reason why I think one of the biggest limitations of this EFF manifesto, what should have constituted the heart of the manifesto, is to deal with basic services that have virtually collapsed. I mean, who can believe me saying that basic services and the townships were in a much better state? Believe me, if you talk of infrastructure and social conditions, under the apartheid years than it is now. It is mess, completely an unmitigated mess, the townships. That should have constituted, not that the land issue and job creation is not important, but I believe that that should be the heart. In fact, that is precisely why Joburg is failing. All the coalition partners, if you go and study this thing, go and look at what is, they do not have a common program of policies and action. That is what, I mean, who discusses, for example, I just want to give you 2 examples. Who discusses what negative impact prepaid water and electricity meters have done in black townships? Often in winter, let me tell you, households, unless they're registered as indigents, which is a demeaning and stigmatizing process, they go without water and electricity during winter months because they don't have money to recharge expired meters. Who talks about that? Who talks about the frustrations of the indigency policy? Meaning that if you're too poor, you don't work, you've got to be subjected to a mean pit. And I'm just saying these are some of the key issues that the EFF doesn't deal with, unfortunately.
In fact, if you don't have that 5,000 Rand or 4,000 Rand per household, you will not be reconnected, and usually the disconnection comes during winter. And so, Dr. Harvey, just very quickly for us, when you say that at a local government level and a national government level, coalitions would work differently, what would make them work differently? What would be the difference from what we are seeing now?
Precisely that they are at national level. You must remember the heart of service delivery is local government, and that is where the issues are most combustible. You can see what is happening. This is where the rubber hits the tarmac. It's basic service, it's explosive, it's combustible. You see what's happening in the townships. So you don't have that level of antagonism, that you, at national level, when you have that nationally constituted coalition government, then you would have in Kagiso or in Joburg, Soweto with local government, a very different ball game, But we have to see how this national coalition government, which I believe is unstoppable. I'm certain that the ANC is going to lose the 2024, and you sit with the nationally constituted ANC, EFF, and DA coalition government,